Hello, welcome to the Housing Sector Podcast. Today, Matt and I have been in each other's orbits, like so many people, for some time. However, we both appeared on a podcast earlier this week. It's the 10th of September today. We recorded earlier this week. We were on another podcast. And Matt, you mentioned something which I knew nothing about and has caused me great concern and worry. And that was evacuations, people being evacuated from their homes because they weren't safe. Can you enlighten me a bit on this?
Yeah, and first of all, sorry to frighten you or put the cat amongst the pigeons. I mean, it's an element of what happens in a building when it's deemed to be unsafe, when it's got to a point where a level of safety, adequate mitigations can't be put in place, and the authorities say, do you know what, enough is enough. This building can no longer be occupied. So if we're focusing on blocks of flats at the moment that we tend to be talking about, it's where either the local authority or the local fire service get to a point where they say, we need to prohibit this building. So it's called a prohibition notice, and effectively that is a notice that legally compels the building to be evacuated either in part or in the whole. So that's what is colloquially called either a prohibition, a decant, an evacuation, call it what you like, but something that is more than just there's been a fire or a power cut in this building, we need to move people into a hotel for a night so we can tidy up and move everybody back. This is more of you're out until further notice, and that may be never. It may be in weeks, it may be in months. And we've been tracking these prohibition notices since going back to 2021. We started tracking them early 2021, but the date that we went back to was the day after Grenfell, and posed the question of how many times has this happened in England since Grenfell, for what reasons, and how many people were involved, and those sorts of things, and where's the source of the information. And that is the latest count, just over 14,500 residents have, across about 54 or 55 individual blocks or developments, have been through that hideous experience.
So let me just be clear, 14,500.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's 14,500 that are out of their home, almost sort of, how does this process happen? Are they given notice? Is it, we've got to get you out?
It depends from case to case. I mean, in some cases, there's a lot of preamble to this, and a date is set in the future. And that happened up in Liverpool just recently, where the residents were told, effectively, when your waking watch can no longer be funded, there will be a prohibition notice and you will have to get out. And that, I assume you've discussed waking watch before, but if I need to go through what waking watch is, I can.
Let's do that. I provided that service to Green Square Accord, who refused to pay me for it. I don't blame them. Okay. But yeah, a waking watch. If you could explain that, please.
In simple terms, a human fire alarm. So it's based on the National Fire Chief's guidance that if you need to change your evacuation strategy for a block of flats into a simultaneous evacuation, so everybody out at the same time when they hear the alarm, if you don't have a building-wide alarm system, which you wouldn't in a stay-put building, somebody needs to raise that alarm and then manage the evacuation of the people. So the Fire Chief's guidance said when your building is deemed to need simultaneous evacuation because it's got building safety issues, but you don't have an alarm, in that interim period, you need a human alarm, which is a waking watch. Very expensive, consume a lot of people because it's 24-hour cover typically. So long story short, in Liverpool, the building in Liverpool, they ran out of money to fund paying for the waking watch, and were given a date that effectively the local council stepped in and said, well, we'll cover a month or whatever it was. At the end of that month, if the problems aren't resolved, there will be a prohibition notice. So in that case, the residents had quite a long lead-in to losing access to their homes. In other examples where a report might come back, which is really severe, it has been as short as, sort of from a resident's perspective, same-day notice. You need to be out by 3 o'clock this afternoon, or whatever the time frame is. That's not to say the people that ran the building didn't know for a period of time in advance what was coming or what was potentially likely to happen. So typically when a structural engineer, for example, looks at a building, it takes a while for them to write their report, but they will typically feed back to the client to say, look, this isn't going to be good. We found these issues. It will take some time for us to produce the formal report, but get ready. And that's that often isn't passed on to residents. Or the fire service, are talking to the building managers but not talking to residents. So yeah, anywhere from virtually no notice right through to weeks or months is the range.
And is there a duty of care? If you own one of these buildings, do you have to ensure, if possible, I suppose, that the people that you're rehoming are kept local so kids can keep the schools going, family connections, or could they be sent anywhere in the country?
It's an interesting question. I don't think there is actually any, other than an ethical duty, if you like, to support. As far as I'm aware, there's no legal duty. The legal power is to prohibit the building, not prohibit the building and look after the people that have been prohibited. So there is no duty of care, as far as I'm aware, from the fire service or the local authority. That being said, the local authority would be responsible for people that present as homeless, for example. So they do get sort of drawn back into the loop. And quite often what happens is if there's a developer, for example, recently down in Southampton, there was a number of prohibitions that the developer is going to, under the developer contract, remediation contract, is going to step in and fix the buildings or remediate the buildings. And I think in that example, they've been involved in sourcing and I assume paying for temporary accommodation for residents that have been turfed out. So it's a bit of a lottery, really, and it's not something that is often talked about in the media in terms of what happens to those people 3, 6 weeks, 9 weeks, 2 months down the line. Once that decision, because the flurry of media activities on the day that you see people with their suitcases leaving, not necessarily what happens to them weeks later. Apologies, I've got my beeping text messages coming in, so apologies for that.
No, that wasn't picked up at all. So if this is yeah, okay, I can understand if we're going to be out for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Okay, I can put up with that. I could put up with me and my wife and our cats being in a travel lodge per se. But if that's going to go on 6 months, 12 months, you know, how can that ever be considered acceptable? How have the buildings gotten into this condition? I've got too many questions for you, Matt. I don't know where to start.
They are very good questions. I think to answer the question at the high level, because of decades of poor practice when it comes to, there's a reason why Grenfell got into the state Grenfell got into. Multiple failings. There's no reason why those failings wouldn't transfer into other buildings. So shoddy buildings, effectively, that are masked by plasterboard and cladding systems, etc. It's not until you start intrusively poking holes in those structures and finding, either things that should be there that are not, or things that shouldn't be there that are, like huge cracks in concrete frames, those sorts of things. And what is happening because of the Building Safety Act and because of all the good stuff happening after Grenfell, in terms of, and I use good stuff to mean investigations to make sure buildings are safe, things are being found. And it's the classic case of once you see it, you can't unsee it. When it was covered up, there's sort of some plausible deniability from a management perspective, but the minute you expose that and an expert looks and says this is wrong, that's at the point that action has to be taken, and that action can ultimately lead to a prohibition or a decant of a building for sometimes forever. There are some that have never been reoccupied and will never be reoccupied, or they've been demolished. Others are then remediated to a degree to make them tolerably safe, and then people move back in.
So and what happens to? I mean, look, we're packing up everyone and going. What about all my white goods? My dining room table, my televisions. Where's all this going?
Typically, as I understand it, all gets left in situ, depending on how long you have and how much access you're given. Because at a certain point, once the prohibition notice is in place, effectively you are breaking the law to re-enter that building. Quite draconian. So depending on how much you can get out prior to, sometimes it's people just with a bit of just a suitcase or an overnight bag, or it could be a removal van emptying the flat completely. It just really depends on how much notice you've got.
Yeah.
Or not got.
We've got, the country's at breaking point. We've got a shortage of homes. we've got constantly in the news, migrants being held in, four-star, and it's not four-star, but being held in hotels, and we've got the demonstrations going on there. How many people can we realistically evacuate for long periods of time?
A good question. I don't know. I mean, I have been encouraging or asking the Ministry of Housing to actually model this. There have been some discussions back recently. I think they're starting to see this as for the risk that it is, rather than previously sort of downplaying it as being just something that wasn't measured. At the moment, you're sort of dealing with, although there are large pockets of people, they're in geographically dispersed areas. I would imagine it's sort of at the level at the moment over a period of years that we can cope. I think the real risk comes if you look at somewhere like London, where there are around about 1,400 blocks of flats that have simultaneous evacuation in place, which means that they can't support stay put typically, which means they have building safety issues. How many of those potentially could be very close to that prohibition decision? And if that decision was taken, how many people would that be in the context of London that were looking for additional housing? It's a difficult one, really something that local authorities should be modelling and understanding what their exposure is. And hopefully it will never happen, but to understand what the contingencies may be. But the fact that there's an unavailability or inavailability of temporary housing in an area shouldn't force people to stay in materially unsafe homes. And I wonder sometimes whether that factor is something that's keeping people in buildings that they shouldn't really be in from a safety perspective.
So council's going, for Christ's sake, don't take that bit of plasterboard down. We don't want to know what's behind there.
Well, or if there's if you're very close to a decision, to the fire service know what the problems are with the building, then it's a judgment call as to do we prohibit or do we leave people in that building with conditions and supervision. Bearing in mind that fire services are under political control. I'm not saying I've got any evidence of political persuasion in that sense, but they are funded by councils and council taxpayers, and then significant costs and inconvenience would fall on council taxpayers if those buildings were to be vacated, in addition to the inconvenience and upheaval of the people that are actually living in the buildings.
And presumably, just to make some of these homes safe is a massive undertaking with moving people out and then the funding to make the building safe. We can't do it, can we?
No, there are a lot that, I mean, you've probably seen in the news about the gateway delays, the sort of the various stop-go points that the government have put in place post-Grenfell for doing work on existing and new higher risk buildings. So we're talking about high rises. And those gateways are well trailed, that they're not being passed quickly enough, and sort of an element of the submissions coming from the industry that want to do the work not being sufficient, the regulator not being sufficient to cope with the processing the inquiries, which leads to a delay. So, for example, something that should take 12 weeks to get approval might take 50 weeks. Well, that 38-week extension could potentially exacerbate the length of time that those people are out of their homes before they can go back, because you're waiting for the approval to go and do the work to make the building safe. So there is a resource constraint, and then that's, as you rightly identify, after you've worked through who's going to pay the bill. Which of these defects or problems would be covered by some kind of funding pot? Which ones would fall onto leaseholders because they're not defects, but they've accumulated over time? Warranty claims, retrospectively suing developers, designers, you name it. There's for each building, there's quite a delicate balance of legal investigation that needs to go on to actually work out how do we pull the 10 million together, or whatever the figure is, to actually fix the problem. And then that's before we get the approval to actually go and do the work, and then do the work. So it's not a 5-minute fix usually.
We've got the National Housing Federation and the Chartered Institute of Housing some event this week. Forgive me for not taking note of the name of the latest one. Why isn't this, front and center of their conversations? And why aren't we all aware of this through the media?
I think with regard to remediations, it's in the media. You know, Sky have run a national story on my data last December. It does get picked up occasionally, but because it's not happening all the time, it's locally, it becomes a local story. It's not really an epidemic, if you like, until you sum up all of the various events. But still, well, it's 53 buildings or developments, it's only this number of people or whatever, it's not happening every day. You know, there's ways to minimize that. The way I look at it is say, well, if it's 14,500 people, that's 14,500 people whose lives have been upended for an indeterminate period of time for issues that are absolutely not of their doing. This is a scandal within a scandal. But the building X has got Grenfell cladding and it's been on for X many years is a far more emotive story than somebody has been moved out because their building is unsafe and they'll go back in maybe 3 or 4 months' time in Southampton or Birmingham or wherever it is. So, you know, I would like that to remain the case in the sense of it not being an epidemic. But I think we do need to understand the numbers, we need to understand the trends, the root causes, and make sure that we've got proper support in place for anyone that is impacted by this going forward, because it makes a hideous situation 10 times as hideous as it was before, effectively.
Matt, I probably should have started the call with this question. What's your background? How did you get involved in any of this?
That's a very long question, or a very long answer to a simple question. So going right back, originally I started in construction, so I used to be a house builder and built flats, etc., etc. Got out of that, went into property management, and ultimately into the very early stages of the internet, developing software products, including selling and letting of commercial property, into risk management, doing what I'm doing today with a team of people, helping people manage their risks and identify and manage the compliance. And then Grenfell happened, and we were already supporting a number of property customers, but also financial services, healthcare, education, to comply with compliance codes or manage their compliance. And Grenfell happened, and one of the immediate learnings from that was that information that should have existed didn't exist. People were looking at the wrong versions of documentation, the fire service didn't have the right information. And Dame Judith Hackett came along and said, we need to fix this, we need to implement a golden thread of building information. And I said, well, I have the construction background, the risk management background, I have a software platform that does exactly what Dame Judith is talking about. We need to really push this because we can help people immediately, we don't need to wait. That was 7 years ago, and we're still waiting for the big uptick in adoption of this kind of thinking. Despite it being the law, the activity on the ground is not moving at the pace that I think most residents would expect or demand or deserve.
How does that make you feel?
Frustrated. I mean, it's commercially frustrating, of course, because fewer customers, but ethically frustrating in the sense that you can see the clear benefits of even making sure that risk assessments are done on time, or equipment is serviced properly and you know by a competent engineer, and the impact that that has on building safety, that it can actually, you know, it might be that system that wasn't working yesterday but does work tonight, that's the difference between people living or dying. And this is really important stuff, that people take the right steps and they think about safety and risk management. So what keeps me awake at night forever is that there will be another Grenfell, and it would have been absolutely avoidable again, perhaps if the person that ran that building, was responsible for running it, had actually followed or tried their best to comply with the laws and regulations that have been brought out post-Grenfell. But there is widespread lack of adoption or lack of compliance, if you like, with some of those very simple changes that have come about since Grenfell.
I keep going on about the 1.5 home. Well, it's hard not to when you've got the latest guy. Forgive me for his name again. You know, but a build baby build. Are we, you know, making the problem even worse by now watering down legislation and throwing up homes so quick that in 10 years' time we're going to have even more of these decants needed?
Potentially. I mean, theoretically, with the gateway processes now that new builds have to go through, safer buildings should pop out at the end of the process. what's happening at the moment with them is that they are being delayed at those gateways, back to the points I mentioned earlier around, insufficient information being submitted to the regulator and the regulator not responding in a sufficient way, which is delaying the pipeline of new build. There are still inconsistencies in building regulations and a lot of subjectivity that could retrospectively be found to say there are problems with this cohort of buildings that we are now going to retrospectively change the building regs, and therefore two staircases is a good example where a new block of flats over 18 meters needs at least 2 escape stairs by the new regulations, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, of high-rise buildings at the moment all over the country that have single escape stairs. Well, we're not going to retrofit a second escape stair. That can't be done. But does it then effectively tarnish that single escape stair building for the rest of its life from insurance perspective, for example, or mortgageability or whatever it is? Are we creating this sort of toxic cohort of buildings that are difficult to deal with? And there are thousands of those for various reasons: combustible materials, staircases, insulation, combustible insulation being left on the external walls. The list is endless of inconsistencies that may well come back to bite us in the future if the mood changes.
Beyond yourself, he's obviously making great strides and doing great work. Are there other people building a pathway and a plan to get us out of this situation?
Yeah, I think there's lots of people doing. There are campaign groups that are trying to advocate on behalf of residents. I mean, from my perspective, quite often they're lacking some of the technical nuance that they need, but they're doing their best to make things happen. There are other providers in the industry that I work with that do different parts of this puzzle that sort of say, we're let's get behind it. It is tiring and it is commercially difficult, because the minute you put your head above the parapet and start advocating for the right thing to be done, a lot of people get displeased with that, because there are lots of binary arguments. If we were to abolish leasehold, everything would be fine. Or, if we just keep our heads down and please the regulator, then we'll get our submission through quicker. They're not going to want to take a submission from a troublemaker. Those sorts of balanced arguments that sort of drive that kind of yes man culture, which is I'm just going to sidle up to whoever's in power and never actually criticize what they're doing. I've taken a different path, probably quite a self-destructive path at the time, but one that I feel that, in my opinion, is doing the right thing by the people that are at risk. There's a reason I keep talking about all of the Lords and parliamentary sessions at the moment with the regulator recently are all talking about gateway delays. None of them mention the 13,000 higher risk buildings that are full of people that go to bed every night, that may or may not be safe in their own homes, may or may not be decanted from their own homes. Back to our earlier discussion, it's all about, back to your 1.5 million target. Developer X has 500 new flats that are stuck at a certain gateway stage. That's taking 500 away from the 1.5 million and delaying the hitting of that target. Very little attention is paid to the people that are living in these buildings already and what's happening to their safety, be that physical, financial, emotional. And that's where the failings are in. One of the key failings in this system is it doesn't actually put residents at the center of the decision making, despite what it says on the tin and where the policy intent is.
Birds of a feather flock together, Matt, and you find yourself in good company here. I too have, as you know from following me on LinkedIn, happily to call people out for it, but it doesn't make you any friends, and it certainly doesn't get you any invites.
No, the rebel resident narrative, the troublemaker, the campaigner, the whatever you want to call them, is unfortunately alive and well post Grenfell. And I think that's one of the key things that we haven't learned from Grenfell. There will always be people that cause trouble, but there are a lot of people that are advocating for the right things and calling out bad behaviour that also then get swept up in that troublemaker category. I just always think that if those so-called rebel residents at Grenfell had managed to get an audience, could changes have been made that would have avoided those 72 avoidable deaths? And I think the answer most people would find is yes. Interventions could have taken place. Whether there will be criminal prosecutions that ultimately become successful at some point in the future, I don't know. But I would hope there are a lot of people that struggle to sleep at night as a result of looking back and saying, what could they have done differently 8 years ago, 9 years ago to avoid that outcome? And I think from my perspective, what guides me is I do not want my name on that list of people that could have done more. And that's what drives me to do what I do.
Yeah, we keep having people on, keep finding people, like-minded people, and the fact that, you know, we're not being paid the big bucks. We're not even doing it for the money. We're doing it because we've got skin in the game, and that skin in the game is the safety of our family, of our neighbours, of our friends, of everyone who we love and care about. And I think as we just sort of inevitably plough towards another disaster, there must be people going, you know, have I done enough? And unfortunately, I don't think they have. Matt, as I say, there are many things we could talk about. This is just but one point that came up in a previous podcast that we had from someone else's. Will you come back and talk to us about something else?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I'm always happy to be invited. There's, you know, you could talk for weeks. Well, I certainly could on what's happened over the last 6 or 7 years, what can be improved. But yeah, always happy to come back and take questions.
Thank you. Thank you for being a friend of the housing sector and for your support. It's always appreciated. You're a good man and I appreciate you. Thank you very much indeed, Matt.